3 years ago, my boss humiliated me in front of the whole company and fired me on the spot. He said I was too soft to survive in the real world of business. Today, I own the fastest growing tech startup in Seattle, and guess who's sitting in the lobby with a resume in his hand? That's right, the same man who kicked me to the curb. And he has no idea who he's about to beg for a second chance. The rain was coming down hard that Tuesday morning in March when everything changed. I remember because I was standing by the floor to ceiling windows of the Graywell Dynamics conference room, watching the droplets race down the glass while Victor Langford droned on about quarterly projections. The irony wasn't lost on me later that the weather seemed to mirror what was about to happen to my career. "Nathan, are you even listening?" Victor's sharp voice cut through my thoughts. I turned to face him, noting the familiar sneer that had become his trademark expression whenever he addressed me. The rest of the senior staff shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. They knew that tone, and they knew what usually followed. "Of course, Victor, you were discussing the Q2 numbers." I kept my voice level, professional. 7 years at Graywell had taught me to navigate Victor's moods, though lately they'd been getting worse. "The Q2 numbers that your team delivered, you mean?" His emphasis on "your" carried a weight that made my stomach clench. Numbers that, frankly, raised some questions about resource allocation and management efficiency. I felt the familiar knot forming in my chest. The Meridian project had been a massive success. We'd delivered the AI-powered logistics platform 3 weeks ahead of schedule and 15% under budget. Our client, a major shipping consortium, had already contracted us for 2 additional phases. It was the kind of win that should have had everyone celebrating, not sitting in awkward silence while Victor found ways to diminish it. "The client feedback has been exceptional," I said carefully. "They've already expressed interest in expanding the scope." "Yes, well, client satisfaction is just one metric." Victor leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled in that pretentious way that made me want to roll my eyes. "What concerns me is the precedent this sets. Your team's methodology, while effective in this isolated case, doesn't align with our broader strategic vision." Sarah Chen, our head of engineering, cleared her throat. "With respect, Victor, Nathan's approach on Meridian is exactly what we should be scaling across other projects. The collaborative framework, the agile implementation, the client integration protocols, they're all best practices that—" "Thank you, Sarah. But I didn't ask for a technical deep dive." Victor's interruption was sharp enough to make Sarah recoil slightly. "What I'm addressing is a larger concern about leadership consistency and organizational hierarchy." There it was. The real issue wasn't the project's success or my team's methodology. It was the fact that success made Victor uncomfortable. Over the past year, as my projects gained recognition and my team grew, I'd watched Victor become increasingly territorial. Client meetings that used to include the full senior staff gradually became Victor-only affairs. Strategic decisions that had traditionally been collaborative discussions turned into pronouncements from on high. The meeting dragged on for another 20 minutes, with Victor systematically undermining every positive aspect of the Meridian project. By the time we filed out of the conference room, I felt like I'd been through a psychological meat grinder. My team, who should have been celebrating a major victory, looked demoralized and confused. "What was that about?" Sarah asked as we walked back toward the development wing. Her usually upbeat demeanor had been replaced by a troubled frown. "Politics," I replied, though that didn't begin to capture the complexity of what was happening. Victor had always been ambitious, but lately his ambition had taken on a desperate edge. Graywell was a mid-sized firm in a competitive market, and Victor was acutely aware that his position wasn't as secure as he pretended it to be. The next few days passed in a strange calm that should have warned me something was brewing. Victor was unusually quiet during staff meetings, offering only perfunctory comments on ongoing projects. He spent most of his time in his office with the door closed, and I caught him on several phone calls that ended abruptly when anyone walked by. It wasn't until Friday that I understood what he'd been planning. I was in my office, reviewing proposals for the next phase of the Meridian project, when Victor appeared in my doorway. He wasn't alone. Janet Morrison from HR stood slightly behind him, clutching a manila folder with the kind of grip that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. Nathan, do you have a few minutes? Victor's tone was artificially casual, the way people sound when they're about to deliver bad news and want to pretend it's routine. Of course, I gestured to the chairs across from my desk, but Victor remained standing. Janet stepped forward and placed the folder on my desk with a slight tremor in her hand. I'm afraid we need to discuss some organizational changes, Victor began, his voice taking on the formal cadence he used for presentations. As you know, the company has been evaluating our operational structure, looking for ways to streamline efficiency and reduce redundancy. The words hit me like cold water. I'd heard this speech before, usually right before someone got laid off, but that couldn't be right. My projects were profitable, my team was productive, and my client relationships were strong. There had to be some mistake. I don't understand, I said, reaching for the folder. My performance reviews have been consistently positive, and the Meridian Project, while superficially successful, highlighted some concerning trends in your management approach. Victor's interruption was swift and practiced. Your tendency toward, shall we say, unconventional methods has created inconsistencies in our service delivery model. I opened the folder and found a termination letter dated that morning. The language was clinical and cold, full of corporate euphemisms that boiled down to one simple fact. I was being fired. This is effective immediately, Janet said quietly. Her eyes focused on a spot somewhere over my left shoulder. Your access to company systems has been suspended, and security will escort you out after you've collected your personal items. The room seemed to tilt slightly. 7 years of my life, 7 years of 60-hour weeks and weekend calls and missed family dinners, reduced to a form letter and a cardboard box. I looked up at Victor, searching his face for some sign of regret or uncertainty, but found only cold satisfaction. You said unconventional methods. I managed, my voice sounding strange and distant. What specifically are you referring to? Your collaborative approach, while well-intentioned, undermines the clear chain of command that clients expect from a professional services firm. Victor's answer came too quickly, too smoothly. He'd rehearsed this. Your tendency to involve junior staff in strategic decisions creates confusion about accountability. And frankly, your resistance to feedback suggests a fundamental misalignment with our corporate culture. Each word was carefully chosen to wound while remaining legally defensible. Victor wasn't just firing me, he was rewriting history to justify it. The collaborative approach he criticized had been implemented at his own suggestion 2 years earlier. The strategic involvement of junior staff had resulted in some of our most innovative solutions, and the only feedback I'd ever resisted was his increasingly erratic attempts to micromanage projects he didn't understand. I see. I closed the folder and looked directly at Victor. In my current projects, the client relationships I've built will be managed by other team members going forward. There was a hint of smugness in his voice now. Don't worry, Nathan, the company will continue to deliver the high-quality service our clients expect. That's when I realized what this was really about. Victor wasn't just eliminating a perceived threat. He was positioning himself to take credit for my work. The Meridian success would become his achievement. The client relationships would become his connections, and the innovative methodologies would become his strategic insights. The next hour passed in a blur of packing personal items, while a security guard watched from the doorway. My team gathered around, confused and upset, asking questions I couldn't answer without risking their own jobs. Sarah looked like she wanted to say something, but I shook my head slightly. There would be time for explanations later, somewhere away from corporate surveillance. As I carried my box of belongings toward the elevator, I could hear Victor in the conference room addressing the remaining staff. His voice carried through the glass walls, confident and authoritative as he explained the transition plan and reassured everyone that operations would continue smoothly. By the time the elevator doors closed, he was already talking about new opportunities and fresh directions. The lobby of Graywell Dynamics had always seemed impressive to me, with its polished marble floors and soaring ceiling. Walking through it as a terminated employee, it felt cold and unwelcoming. The security guard escorted me to the street, where the March rain had intensified. I stood there for a moment, cardboard box growing soggy in my arms, watching the building that had been my professional home for 7 years. That night, I called my wife Linda and tried to explain what had happened. She listened quietly as I described the meeting, the termination letter, and Victor's carefully constructed justifications. When I finished, there was a long pause. "So, what do you think this is really about?" she asked. "Fear," I said without hesitation. "Victor's afraid that my success makes him look bad. He's afraid that clients prefer working with me instead of him. He's afraid that upper management might start wondering why they need him if I can deliver better results with less drama. And he's probably right to be afraid." Linda's observation cut straight to the heart of it. Victor's insecurity wasn't entirely irrational. Over the past year, I had been building stronger client relationships, developing more innovative solutions, and earning more respect from both senior leadership and junior staff. In a company where advancement was largely based on perceived value rather than formal hierarchy, that kind of organic authority was indeed threatening to someone in Victor's position. But understanding his motivation didn't make the betrayal any less painful. I'd been loyal to Graywell, often at the expense of other opportunities. I'd worked weekends and holidays, missed family events, and poured myself into projects that I believed in. The idea that all of that could be erased with a single meeting was devastating. The severance package was generous, probably more generous than Victor would have preferred. 26 weeks of salary plus accumulated vacation time gave me a financial cushion, but it also felt like guilt money. The company knew they were making a mistake, but they were willing to pay to avoid examining it too closely. For the first week after the termination, I fell into a dark routine of sleeping late, checking job boards, and trying to figure out what had gone wrong. The rational part of my mind knew that Victor's accusations were unfounded, but the emotional impact of being publicly dismissed after 7 years of dedication was harder to shake off. It was during one of these brooding sessions that I got a call from Marcus Webb, one of my former colleagues who'd left Graywell 6 months earlier to start his own consulting practice. "I heard what happened," he said without preamble. "Victor's an idiot. Thanks for the sympathy, but that doesn't change my situation." "Actually, it might." Marcus paused, and I could hear typing in the background. "I've been thinking about expanding my practice, bringing in someone with your project management skills and client relationships, interested in a conversation." The idea of going to work for Marcus was appealing, but something about it felt like retreating to familiar territory. I'd spent 7 years building expertise and relationships within the comfortable confines of an established company. Maybe it was time to take a bigger risk. "What if instead of me working for you, we work together?" I asked. "Equal partners, combining your technical skills with my project management experience." I like the sound of that, but what about startup capital? Office space? All the practical stuff? I looked around my home office, with its view of Elliott Bay and the Seattle skyline beyond. We could start lean, home offices, shared resources, focus on building a client base before we worry about overhead. That conversation led to another, and another, until we were sketching out a business plan on napkins at a downtown coffee shop. Marcus had the deep technical expertise in artificial intelligence and machine learning that was becoming increasingly valuable. I had the project management skills and client relationship experience that could turn that expertise into profitable engagements. Within 2 weeks, we'd incorporated ParkLogic LLC, with me as managing partner and Marcus as technical director. The name was partly ego, I'll admit, but it also represented something important to me. This wasn't going to be another faceless consulting firm trading on corporate credibility. It was going to be personal, driven by our individual expertise and commitment to clients. Our first challenge was finding clients without the marketing muscle of an established firm behind us. I started reaching out to my professional network, carefully explaining the situation without disparaging Graywell or Victor. Most people were sympathetic and supportive, but sympathy doesn't pay the bills. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Jennifer Walsh, the procurement director at Cascade Shipping, had been my primary contact on the Meridian project. 3 weeks after the termination, she called me directly. "Nathan, I heard you'd left Graywell. I hope you don't mind, but I got your number from Sarah Chen." "Not at all, Jennifer. How can I help you?" "Actually, I was hoping you could help us." We've been discussing the next phase of the logistics platform with Victor, but frankly, his vision for the project doesn't align with what we're trying to accomplish. When we asked specifically for you to lead the engagement, he told us you were no longer available. My heart rate picked up. I'm available, just not through Graywell. I've started my own consulting practice. Perfect. Can you put together a proposal for the Phase 2 work? Same scope as what we discussed before. But I want to see your approach without any corporate constraints. That single conversation changed everything. The Phase 2 contract was worth more than my annual salary at Graywell, and it came with the promise of additional work if we performed well. More importantly, it validated my decision to strike out on my own. Marcus and I threw ourselves into the Cascade project with an intensity that surprised even us. Without corporate bureaucracy slowing us down, we were able to implement solutions faster and more efficiently than we'd ever managed at larger firms. The collaborative approach that Victor had criticized became our signature methodology, and clients loved the direct access to decision makers. The first year was a whirlwind of 18-hour days and constant learning. We hired 2 junior developers, rented a small office in Capitol Hill, and reinvested every dollar of profit back into the business. By the end of year 1, we had 6 full-time employees and a client roster that included 3 Fortune 500 companies. Year 2 brought new challenges and bigger opportunities. The artificial intelligence market was exploding, and our early expertise in machine learning applications put us ahead of larger competitors who were still figuring out the technology. We landed contracts with healthcare systems, financial services firms, and government agencies, each one teaching us something new about scaling our capabilities. The growth was intoxicating, but it was also exhausting. There were nights when I'd fall asleep at my desk, mornings when I'd wake up in a panic about deadlines, and weekends when Linda would have to remind me that I had a family outside of work. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was working harder than I ever had at Graywell, but I was doing it for something I believed in. By the middle of year 2, we were getting attention from industry publications and venture capital firms. The Seattle tech scene is relatively small, and word travels fast when a new company starts winning contracts that used to go to established players. We were invited to speak at conferences, quoted in articles about AI trends, and approached by larger firms interested in acquisition discussions. It was during one of these industry events that I ran into Sarah Chen. She'd left Graywell 6 months after my termination and was working for a startup in the biotech space. Over coffee, she filled me in on what had happened at our old company after my departure. It wasn't pretty, she said, stirring sugar into her latte. Victor tried to take over your client relationships, but he didn't understand the technical aspects well enough to maintain credibility. Cascade Shipping terminated their contract within 3 months. 2 other major clients followed them out the door. What about the rest of the team? Most of us left within the first year. Victor brought in his own people, but they didn't have the institutional knowledge or client relationships to maintain the same level of service. Revenue dropped by about 30%, and upper management started asking hard questions. Sarah's report confirmed what I'd been hearing through other channels. Graywell's reputation in the Seattle market was suffering, and they were losing ground to competitors who offered more innovative approaches and better client service. It should have felt like vindication, but mostly it just felt sad. Good people had lost their jobs because of one man's insecurity and poor judgment. The real validation came during year 3, when Park Logic was selected as the primary contractor for a major federal modernization initiative. The Department of Defense was updating their logistics systems, and they needed a firm with both technical expertise and proven project management capabilities. The contract was worth $12 million over 2 years, making us one of the fastest-growing tech firms in the Pacific Northwest. That's when we moved into our new headquarters in South Lake Union, the heart of Seattle's tech corridor. The building was modern and efficient, with open floor plans designed to encourage collaboration and creativity. We'd grown to 42 employees, including some of the best AI researchers and project managers in the region. I was reviewing staffing projections for the DoD contract when my assistant knocked on my office door. "Mr. Park, there's someone here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says it's regarding employment opportunities." "Did he say which company he's representing?" No, sir. He's actually looking for a job here. He's been waiting in the lobby for about an hour. That was unusual. Most employment inquiries came through our HR department or our website. Senior level candidates typically scheduled formal interviews rather than showing up unannounced, but we were growing fast, and good talent was always welcome. What's his background? He didn't provide specifics, but he mentioned several years of management experience in the tech sector. He seems very eager to speak with you personally. I glanced at my calendar. The afternoon was relatively light, and curiosity was getting the better of me. All right, give me 5 minutes and then send him in. I spent those 5 minutes finishing up an email to our DoD liaison and clearing some space on my desk. The success of the past 3 years had taught me to be cautious about hiring decisions. Technical skills were important, but cultural fit was crucial. We'd built something special at ParkLogic, and preserving that culture was essential to our continued growth. The knock on my door came exactly 5 minutes later, followed by footsteps and my assistant's voice making introductions. I looked up from my computer screen and felt the world shift slightly on its axis. Victor Langford stood in my office doorway, holding a leather portfolio and wearing an expression that tried to project confidence, but couldn't quite hide the desperation underneath. He was thinner than I remembered, his hair grayer, and his expensive suit couldn't disguise the fact that he looked tired and beaten down. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I could see the exact instant when recognition hit him, watching his face cycle through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been panic. The confident smile he'd worn when entering my office faltered and disappeared entirely. "Nathan," he said finally, his voice carrying none of the authority I remembered. "I didn't realize, when I asked to speak with the owner, I didn't know it was you." "Hello, Victor?" I kept my voice neutral, professional. "Please, have a seat." He hesitated for a moment, as if sitting down would somehow make this more real, then slowly lowered himself into one of the chairs across from my desk. The portfolio remained clutched in his hands like a shield. "I suppose you're wondering what I'm doing here," he said, attempting to regain some composure. The thought had occurred to me. Victor opened his portfolio and withdrew a resume, placing it carefully on my desk. "I'm exploring new opportunities, and ParkLogic has developed quite a reputation in the industry. I thought my experience might be valuable to a growing organization." I picked up the resume and scanned it quickly. The Graywell experience was prominently featured, with Victor listed as Vice President of Strategic Operations. There was no mention of the company's declining performance or his eventual departure. The dates were carefully fudged to suggest he'd left voluntarily rather than being pushed out. "Your experience at Graywell," I said, looking up from the paper. "How would you characterize your time there?" "Challenging, but rewarding. I led several major initiatives, including the successful completion of the Meridian project, which established new benchmarks for client satisfaction and operational efficiency." The casual appropriation of my work was breathtaking in its audacity. Victor was sitting in my office, asking for a job, while simultaneously taking credit for the project that had launched my career as an entrepreneur. If I hadn't been so stunned by the sheer nerve of it, I might have been impressed. "The Meridian project," I repeated slowly. "That was your initiative?" "Absolutely. I conceptualized the framework, assembled the team, and managed the client relationship throughout the engagement. It was one of my proudest achievements at Graywell." I set the resume down and leaned back in my chair. The old Nathan, the loyal employee who'd absorbed criticism and accepted blame to keep the peace, might have let this slide, but the past 3 years had taught me the value of calling out dishonesty when I saw it. That's interesting, Victor, because I remember the Meridian project quite differently." Something flickered in his eyes, a recognition that this conversation wasn't going the way he'd planned. "Well, memory can be subjective, can it? Different people involved in a complex project might remember their contributions differently." "True, but some contributions are more documented than others." I turned to my computer and pulled up a folder I'd saved from my Graywell days: client emails, project specifications, meeting notes, and progress reports, all with my name on them. I'd kept these files partly for reference, partly for portfolio purposes. and partly because some instinct had told me I might need them someday. Here's an email from Jennifer Walsh at Cascade Shipping, thanking me personally for the innovative approach to their logistics challenges. Here's another from their CEO, praising the collaborative methodology that made the project such a success. And here's the project proposal, authored by Nathan Park and approved by the senior leadership team. Victor's face had gone pale, and he was gripping his portfolio so tightly that his knuckles were white. Nathan, I think there might be some misunderstanding about... There's no misunderstanding. Victor, you fired me for the same collaborative approach you're now claiming as your own achievement. You told me I was too soft for the business world, that my methods were unconventional and problematic. The words hung in the air between us, carrying 3 years of suppressed anger and betrayal. Victor opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, apparently realizing that any excuse would only make things worse. I know what you did after I left. I continued. You tried to take over my client relationships, but you couldn't maintain them because you never understood the work in the first place. You brought in your own people, but they couldn't replicate the results because the results were based on trust and collaboration, not corporate politics. Nathan, please, I made some mistakes, I'll admit that, but that was a different time, different pressures. I've learned from those experiences. Have you? Because sitting here and lying about your role in my projects suggests you haven't learned much at all. Victor slumped slightly in his chair, the last vestiges of his professional persona crumbling. I need this job. Nathan, Graywell let me go 8 months ago. I've been looking for something comparable ever since, but the market is competitive, and my reputation, there have been some challenges. For the first time since he'd walked into my office, Victor was being honest. I could see the desperation he'd been trying to hide, the fear of a middle-aged executive who'd burned bridges and found himself obsolete in a rapidly changing industry. Why should I help you, Victor? Why should I give you the chance you never gave me? Because you're a better person than I am. His answer was quiet, defeated. Because you understand that good people sometimes make bad decisions, and that everyone deserves a second chance. It was a calculated appeal to my better nature. But there was enough genuine remorse in his voice to give me pause. The vengeful part of me wanted to humiliate him the way he'd humiliated me, to tell him exactly what I thought of his leadership style and his character. But the rational part of my mind was already considering the larger implications. Park Logic had succeeded because we'd built a culture based on trust, collaboration, and mutual respect. Hiring someone who embodied the opposite of those values would be destructive to everything we'd created. More importantly, Victor's fundamental approach to management, his need to control and diminish others to elevate himself, hadn't changed. His desperate circumstances might make him temporarily humble, but leopards don't change their spots. I appreciate your honesty, Victor, but I don't think Park Logic is the right fit for you. Nathan, please, I'm willing to start at a lower level, work my way back up. I've learned from my mistakes. Have you, though? Because 20 minutes ago, you were trying to take credit for work you not only didn't do, but actively criticized. That doesn't suggest someone who's learned from their mistakes. That suggests someone who's learned to be more careful about getting caught. Victor flinched as if I'd struck him. I was trying to present my experience in the best possible light. It's what everyone does on their resume. No, Victor, it's what dishonest people do on their resume. The people I hire tell me about their real contributions, their actual failures, and the lessons they've learned from both. They don't steal credit for other people's work and hope nobody notices. I stood up, walking around my desk to look out the window at the Seattle skyline. 3 years ago, I'd been sitting in a similar office, packing my belongings while Victor explained why I wasn't good enough for his company. The reversal of fortune would have been satisfying if it weren't so pathetic. You know what the real irony is, Victor? You were right about one thing when you fired me. I was too soft for your version of the business world, but it turns out there's another version of the business world, one where collaboration beats competition, where trust beats fear, and where treating people well actually leads to better results. I understand that now, Victor said quickly. I see what you've built here, and I respect it. I want to be part of something like this. I turned back to face him. But you can't be part of something like this, Victor, because you don't understand what this is. Like, you see the success, the growth, the contracts, and you want those things, but you don't see the foundation those things are built on. You don't see the late nights we spent solving problems together instead of assigning blame. You don't see the way we celebrate each other's successes instead of hoarding credit. You don't see the trust that makes all of this possible. I could learn, I could change. Maybe you could, but not here. You'd be starting from too deep a hole, with too much history and too many bad habits. My team knows what happened at Graywell. They know how you treated people, including me. Hiring you would send exactly the wrong message about what we value and who we are as a company. Victor sat in silence for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he looked up, there was a resignation in his eyes along with the desperation. So what happens now? You have me escorted out by security. Get your revenge? The question surprised me, partly because it revealed how he would have handled the situation if our roles were reversed. No, Victor, no security, no public humiliation. You're going to walk out of here the same way you walked in, with whatever dignity you have left intact. That's it? That's it. We're not hiring insecure managers who build themselves up by tearing others down. We're building something better here, something based on different principles. I hope you find a place where you fit, but it's not with us. Victor gathered his portfolio and stood slowly, moving like a man much older than his 50-some years. At the office door, he paused and looked back at me. For what it's worth, Nathan, I am sorry. You were right about a lot of things, and I was wrong about more. I hope you can find it in yourself to forgive me someday. I already have, Victor. Holding on to anger would just poison what we're building here. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean giving you access to hurt my people the way you hurt me. He nodded once, understanding the distinction, and walked out of my office, through the glass wall. I watched him make his way across the open work area, past teams of engineers and project managers collaborating on solutions to complex problems. A few people looked up as he passed, but most were too focused on their work to pay attention to another visitor. At the elevator, Victor turned for one last look at the office. I could see him taking in the energy, the collaboration, the sense of purpose that permeated everything we did. It was everything he'd claimed to want during his time at Graywell, but had never been able to create because he'd never understood that leadership isn't about control or credit. It's about creating conditions where other people can do their best work. The elevator doors closed, and Victor disappeared from view. I stood at my window for a few more minutes, watching the Seattle traffic crawl through the streets below. 3 years ago, I'd been devastated by the injustice of losing my job. Today, I understood that being fired was the best thing that had ever happened to my career. A soft knock on my door interrupted my thoughts. Marcus Webb, my co-founder and now chief technology officer, stepped into the office with a concerned expression. Everything all right? Janet said you had an unusual visitor. Victor Langford. He was looking for a job. Marcus's eyebrows shot up. The same Victor Langford who fired you from Graywell. The very same. Please tell me you had him thrown out by security. I laughed. The first genuine laugh I'd had all day. No, I just told him we weren't hiring insecure managers. He got the message. You're a better man than I am. I would have enjoyed that conversation way too much. 3 years ago, I might have felt the same way, but success is the best revenge. Marcus, we've built something here that's worth more than any petty satisfaction I could get from humiliating someone who's already been humiliated by his own failures. Marcus nodded, understanding immediately. It was one of the things I valued most about our partnership. The way we could communicate complex ideas with just a few words. Speaking of what we've built, the DoD team wants to schedule another review meeting. They're talking about expanding the scope of the contract. How much expansion? Another $8 million, possibly more. They want us to handle the integration with their European operations. I felt the familiar thrill of a new challenge, a bigger opportunity to test our capabilities and grow our impact. 3 years ago, I'd been grateful for a single client and a modest contract. Now we were being trusted with projects that would affect military logistics around the world. set up the meeting, and Marcus, let's make sure we have our best people on this, not because we need to prove anything to anyone, but because we've earned the right to do work that matters. As Marcus left to make the arrangements, I returned to my desk and the stack of resumes from legitimate job candidates. Each one represented someone's hopes and ambitions, their desire to be part of something bigger than themselves. In a few hours, I'd be interviewing people who shared our values and wanted to contribute to our mission. The irony wasn't lost on me that Victor's unexpected visit had crystallized something important about what we'd built at ParkLogic. We weren't just a successful business. We were a community of people who believed that work could be meaningful, that success could be shared, and that treating people well was not only morally right, but strategically smart. Through my office window, I could see our team collaborating on solutions, sharing ideas, and building something that would outlast any individual contribution. It was everything I'd dreamed of during those dark days after my termination, and more than I'd dared to hope for when we'd started the company in my living room. The phone on my desk buzzed with an internal call. "Mr. Park, there's someone from the Seattle Business Journal here to interview you about the federal contract. Should I send them up?" "Give me 5 minutes, then yes." As I prepared for another interview about our success, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The humiliation of being fired had forced me to examine my assumptions about loyalty, security, and success. The struggle of starting a company had taught me about resilience, creativity, and the value of surrounding yourself with people who share your vision. Most importantly, the experience of building ParkLogic had shown me that the collaborative approach Victor had criticized wasn't a weakness. It was our greatest strength. In a world where technology was becoming increasingly complex and markets were becoming increasingly competitive, the ability to bring out the best in other people wasn't just nice to have, it was essential for survival. The journalist arrived with a photographer and a list of questions about our rapid growth, our client relationships, and our plans for the future. As I answered their questions, I found myself thinking about the broader story, the transformation from loyal employee to successful entrepreneur, from victim of corporate politics to leader of industry innovation. "What would you say to other professionals who find themselves in similar situations?" the journalist asked. "People who've been let go from established companies and are wondering about their next steps." I paused, thinking about Victor's desperate visit and the thousands of other professionals who were facing similar crossroads in their careers. I'd say that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you professionally turns out to be the best thing that could have happened. But only if you're willing to use it as an opportunity to examine your assumptions, clarify your values, and build something better than what you had before. Any regrets about leaving the corporate world? None whatsoever. Corporate security is largely an illusion anyway. The only real security comes from knowing that you can create value wherever you go, and that you've built relationships based on trust and mutual respect rather than hierarchical authority. After the interview, I spent some time walking through the office, checking in with various teams and projects. The energy was palpable. The kind of focused enthusiasm that comes from people who believe in what they're doing and trust the people they're doing it with. Sarah Chen, who joined us 6 months earlier as head of client services, was leading a brainstorming session with junior developers. The collaborative methodology that had gotten me fired at Graywell was now being taught to the next generation of tech professionals, not as a revolutionary concept, but